All right, I think I'm going to record. Oh, we are recording as we are already recording. That's great. So I'm going to start with introductions. Thank you for coming to the Data Visualization and Visual Culture breakout room. Our first speaker is Chelsea Thompto, Assistant Professor of Digital Media at SJSU. Chelsea Thompto, a transdisciplinary artist and educator working at the intersection of art, trans studies, and technology. She is an assistant professor of digital media art in the Department of Art and Art History at San Jose State University. She received an MFA and MA in 4D art and an MA in gender and women's studies from the University of Wisconsin-Madison and has shown her work nationally and internationally. So thank you for being with us, Chelsea.
Thanks, Nick. Really appreciate it. So I have slides to share with you all. Really excited to be here. I'm putting the info in the chat. I'll do it again here in a second because, as we all know, Zoom is not retroactive for the chat. So if more people add in, I will try to do it. The reason I have a link to the slides is because you'll notice that the slides are very link rich themselves, because I know we only have 15 minutes. So I tried to pack in as much information into them as possible. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. And as I do have one other programming note, or two other programming notes rather. The first being that you will see moving images on my slides. None of them have sound though. So as long as you're hearing my voice, you're not missing out on any sound. And the second thing regarding sound is if you hear weird noises in the background, I have an extremely old dog who is snorting and doing all sorts of weird things. So if that gets too distracting, just let me know. So as Nick said, my name is Chelsea Thompto. I'm a research-based transdisciplinary artist, and my work really focuses around the intersection of art, trans studies, and technology. So I want to start really quickly with this image here. So what we see here looks to be a video of a man moving with facial recognition happening on top of his face. But what this really is actually three different forms of machine learning all talking to one another. So first of all, the face that you see is not a real human. Instead, it's the face of a generative adversarial neural network that created this face through being trained on 70,000 different high-resolution images on Flickr. So we start with a fake man, and that was a still image. And then I went and used another machine learning algorithm that takes still images and animates them as if they were real. So the movement is also fake and fed in through machine learning. And then on top of that is the actual facial recognition. So we have a machine that is creating a face, another machine that's moving the face, and then a third machine that's looking at that face and seeing if it is in fact a face, which of course, in this case, it does seem to think that it's a man and that it oscillates between happy, disgusted, angry, and all sorts of other things. So I put this here because what I'm really interested in my work, and one of the things I want to talk about today, I really love that they used visual culture as one of the headings for what I'm doing, because what I'm really interested in looking at is how visual cues throughout technology especially, but throughout our culture, really can give us cues as to like the way that society regards certain people. And for me, I'm really interested in the way society regards trans people, right? So when I say that my work is at the intersection of art, trans studies, and technology, what I'm also saying is I'm a person who's really interested in visual culture that intersects with art, trans studies, and technology. So I want to move on really quickly to another image here. And Nick, please feel free to let me know timing-wise if I'm getting too close. This is an image of an artist book that I created in 2018. And it is not one of the major projects I want to talk with you about today, but it's one of the pieces that I really like because while it's very tactile and it's very much a physical piece, it also really has a lot to owe to digital processes. So it's sitting on a table that was CNC routed. You can see that circular indent. It uses digital photography, digital printing to create this tactile artist book experience. And the reason that I brought that here is because when I'm thinking about the work that I'm making in the media that I'm using, the digital tools that I use, while they're not just happen by happenstance, I'm not also only focused on digital making. So the different tools that I use are listed here: digital media, digital fabrication, creative code, and then a lot of physical tactile media as well. And I think that there's a lot to be said about the way that more traditional modes of thinking and making and researching in the humanities can be brought into a digital space, and that those two things can interact with one another without needing to obliterate the other, right? Like you can do something that is very digitally afflicted while still going to a physical archive and looking at actual objects and doing these things. So I like to talk here about the fact that it's not mutually exclusive. So, if any of these tools or things interest you in particular, all of these links here will either link out to the program that I use, or in the case of the digital fabrication, the machines that I use or the processes themselves for more information about those things. So throughout all of these things, I'm really interested in fascination, transing or trans, archiving, creating and manipulating systems, material specificity, layering, and archival research and visual cultural analysis. And I put this here because I want to make it known and really think about the fact that the digital humanities side of what I'm doing is really informed by the materials that I know how to use, and then these methods or gestures that I use in my creative work, right? So when I'm thinking about using a digital tool in general, I'm thinking about three things. First, if it's code related, I try to make that work open source. I know Nick talked earlier today about open source and using open platforms and how that makes them more durable for preservation. It also makes it more accessible. And so for me personally, I'm interested in the work being manipulated, used, reused, all of these things. And so when I'm thinking about how I'm going to build a project, if there's a way for me to build it using an open source platform, for me, that generally means just code bases that are open source, then I will use those, because I then go and reproduce that information for everyone to use online. And I'll actually share links to that at the end of this presentation. The second thing that I think about when I'm talking about digital consideration is backups of backups. This might seem like a really practical thing, but I actually think it's like super important in terms of archiving and saving work. I try to always have my work backed up in two places in addition to my physical computer. So right now that means two different cloud services, so that if somehow Google Drive totally died or I lost access to it somehow, I would still have an iCloud backup. And then finally, what is the technology doing? So while I often rely on digital tools and media, I'm also very critical of the inherited meanings and biases of a given technology. The digital is not neutral, nor is it immaterial. So when I use digital methods in media, I take time to interrogate the underlying technologies and social political implications. And this is, I think, especially true when we're thinking about current topics of machine learning, facial recognition, which is what the second project is about. So let me get this up here. So I want to talk very briefly about two projects. The first is Productive Bodies, which was produced from 2018 to 2019. This is a piece that looked at the Mississippi River as a metaphor for, and its development as a metaphor for the way trans people and trans bodies have been regarded through medical technology. So it explored explorations of transgender identity in relation to visualization as violence, technology in relation to the body, and how we conceive the boundaries of the self. And in this work, I did archival research, I curated objects, did digital photography, videography, vector graphic design, sound design, 3D modeling, bookbinding, and creative coding. This is another sample of that video. So this is a creative coding generative piece that takes archival map images as well as 3D graphic renderings of what are called gender affirming surgeries. And it puts them together in this infinitely changing perpetual video installation work. This is a way for me to bring the visual references that I'm looking at in my archival research and my database research into conversation with one another in a way that allows for the viewer, in this case, to be able to see the kind of relationship that I'm trying to hold up and trying to put together. So in this case, the code operates as both of a way of juxtaposing these two things and as a way for me to not have to have necessarily a linear narrative, which is another thing that the digital does very powerfully, right? Is that it allows us to hyperlink, to have things be nodal, to have them be rhizomatic rather than linear. And I think that's one thing that the digital humanities does really well. This piece also existed as a nonlinear artist book, which you can see here, which took some of those archival images and used digital printing and 3D modeling to create these. So some of this involved taking archival images from the Army Corps of Engineers and doing things like simple redaction from here to the original image here, or redaction of text to create these sort of redaction poems that were then printed on transparencies. And then they were bound with this custom bookbinding mechanism that I created using 3D modeling. So in this project, I'm using video, like I said, I'm using creative coding, and then I'm using 3D modeling, all to kind of help bolster this non-linear storytelling that I'm interested in doing. And here is a close-up of that image. And Nick, where am I at time-wise?
You are right at 1:30, and we have
Okay.
15 minutes at the end for questions. So
great. So I should wrap up. Yes.
wrap up, but don't rush the wrap.
Okay, great. So the second project I wanted to talk about, and I'll be very brief here, is landmarks. This piece is much more digital. So the reason I put these two together is because if I just showed you this piece, you might think this woman is only digital. She doesn't understand like more hands-on humanities things at all, right? And so this project is a little bit more digitally afflicted, but it is really looking at, again, that idea of like being critical of technology and also using technology. And so this looks at an exploration of artificial intelligence in the way machine learning comprehends trans bodies. And so in this work, I'm doing a lot more heavy lifting on the code side, that is using JavaScript to create interactive experiences for users and also to manipulate actual facial recognition models in the way that those interfaces are overlaying on actual faces, whether that is live facial recognition or pre-recorded. So again, each of these links here will go to the actual library that I used or the different programs that I used to create these different things. In this work, what I was really interested in was having a hands-on exploration of the actual material of the thing. So instead of saying, well, what tool can I use that already does everything for machine learning and I can just kind of dabble in it, I was like, well, what if I actually got underneath the hood and was able to take the default visual ways that these programs create these kind of facial recognition landmarks that we see here, right? How could I go about actually manipulating the source of that in order to really give people a different way to think about this? So in this project, I'm using these actual code bases to create my own visual spaces, but then I'm also using textual references, things that I'm drawing from, things that I'm using to actually create these compositions and to form my own opinions about the problematics around machine learning are then put back up directly onto the screen, right? So here we have Jorge Luis Borges's work on exactitude in science, which talks about this sort of cat chasing its own tail thing around mapping and making a map that is the size of itself. So that's the end. I wanted to thank you all for your time. I know this is like super quick, but I just wanted to show a couple different ways that visual culture can intersect with digital humanities. The links that we have here, the first is to the live website where you can do the facial recognition, but if you're like, I don't want to have my face recognized, the second link is a pre-recorded version of that same thing using MetaHuman to have a very kind of creepy virtual stand-in. The code base for that, my email address, my website, and then my GitHub, which has all the code that I've created over the past 5 years related to my pedagogy and to my my artistic practice. So thank you all.
Thank you, Chelsea. That was awesome. And we're going to have time for questions for both speakers at the end of the lightning talk. Now I'm going to introduce Elizabeth Pollard, who is the professor of history and co-director of the SDSU Center for Comic Studies. Elizabeth Pollard is a distinguished professor for teaching excellence at San Diego State University. where she has been teaching courses in Roman history, world history, and witchcraft studies since 2002. Her research has investigated women accused of witchcraft in the Roman world and explored the exchange of goods and ideas between the Mediterranean and the Indian Ocean in the early centuries of the Common Era. Pollard is co-author of 3 widely adopted textbooks on early world history and the author of articles exploring history pedagogy using Twitter, Wikipedia, and digital humanities. Thank you for being here today.
Thank you, Nick. And just to double check, you're seeing my PowerPoint, correct? Or my Google slide deck? Great. So thank you everyone who's here in the session. I want to thank Pam and Christina for inviting me to share some of my work. In what I share, you're definitely going to hear echoes of some of the presentations earlier today, whether Christina's, how did I make that, or how did they make that, to Nick's description of a project life cycle, to Catherine's comments on digital pedagogy, Pam's comments on labor ethics. So there's lots of hints of all of that in what I'm about to share. You're also going to hear echoes of my nearly 30 years of flirting with the digital. And I can't believe I'm old enough to say 30 years of flirting with the digital, but from being a grad student at the University of Pennsylvania, where I got my start with the digital, coding textual variants of the Septuagint, to my current role as a somewhat wizened scholar teacher, not wise, but wizened scholar teacher, always looking for ways to enliven, even revivify what I'm doing in the classroom, and then taking that further to share it with the broader academic community. So going after Chelsea, I feel a little chastened because as what you were describing is about nonlinear thinking, and as a historian, of course, the linear is very much a part of what I do, change over time, and in fact, what I'll be talking about is timelines. So there is possibilities for being slightly nonlinear in linear thinking, and maybe that's something we could talk about in the Q&A at the end. So to jump into what I want to share with you today, my presentation learning outcomes. First thing I want to do is have you all engage artifacts of student-created history at both the upper and lower division. I want to have us consider the need for learning outcome-driven DH integration, and Pam already hinted at that a little bit. She and I have worked together a lot, so you can see hints of that. I want to identify strategies of scaffolding, recognize the importance of collaboration. Chelsea mentioned this as well, the peek under the hood, and then how to integrate these sorts of pedagogical approaches into research. I'm going to drop something in the chat before I go any further. Hopefully it's the right thing. Yes. So I just dropped into the chat a couple of examples of the timelines that I have created with my students. And I'd encourage you to pick one or the, if your computer can handle it right now, to pick one or the other, to open it and just click through Yes, so the 2 timelines. There is one that's a timeline of sequential art from and comics about ancient Rome. So if you just want to click on that one, you can pop through that that particular artifact of student learning. Another one you could check out is a timeline that I created with my students in a lower division course. The other was an upper division, but in a lower division course that's exploring issues of comics and social justice over time, from the visualizing comics and social justice over time from the Paleolithic to the modern day. And as you look at these, as you click through these, I want to encourage you, if you have the bandwidth to do so, mentally and otherwise, to type into the chat any questions you have about the creation of this kind of artifact. So what I'm doing here is I'm clicking through the timeline, or made a fancy video of me clicking through the timeline. And I'm curious if you have any questions about how this thing was constructed, what it's trying to show, why I chose to do a timeline with students. So I'll give you a chance to think about that for a second. Yeah, I've used my pedagogical tool of counting to 15, waiting for a question. So let me jump to the next slide. And if something comes up as you think of those timelines and poke around, drop it in the chat because I want to circle back to that at the end. But I promise you that I reflect on this issue of learning outcome driven digital humanities. And for me, the most essential question I like to clear up for my students at the beginning of a course that I'm going to integrate digital humanities into so thoroughly is the why. You know, why DH, why visualization? And as a historian, very much this issue of how is visualization in this way going to help them understand something historical that they would not otherwise be able to glean. And I think it's really important to be incredibly overt with your students if you're doing this kind of thing in a class, and with your wider audience if this is a part of your research, and incredibly overt about how visualization, especially some form of digital humanities visualization, is central to the takeaway of what you're doing. And so with my students and in the stuff I publish, I'm really upfront right from the beginning. And this is a slide I use at the very beginning of my Roman history class, where I tell them, you know, this is what I'm doing here is a proposition. I'm proposing to them that I think that using this timeline visualization is going to build their capacity to interpret visual narrative from the past. You know, in other words, that what they're going to do is going to help them visualize antiquity better, and that we're going to start with looking at visualizations that maybe feel more comfortable, comics about ancient Rome, shift into looking at visualizations that feel incredibly foreign, visual narrative from ancient Rome, and then we're going to put those two together on a timeline and step back and say, hey, what have I learned? What questions do I still have? And then go further with that visualization into researching something of interest to them, to the students. So I'm very much about, you know, putting the proposition of what I say is going to happen in the class right in front of the students from the get-go, and to be clear about the digital, to be clear about the visual, and to be clear about the historical payoff of what we're going to do together. Yeah, the same is true in my lower division class, where I do some of the same material, but it's slightly simpler. You know, where I don't explain maybe the higher level thinking, if you're thinking, yeah, the problematic blooms, but the bigger picture of what we're doing, but the nitty gritty of what they're going to be able to do having engaged with this kind of visualization. So again, I think it's super important when doing this kind of project, whether at the upper division or the lower division, to be incredibly overt, incredibly transparent with students about why they're doing what they're doing, why visualization will help, and why digitally assisted visualization is the way to make that happen. Now, another thing I am very big on when I do this kind of work, especially with students, is the scaffolding. You know, helping them with tiny little steps along the way to get to the process that produces a timeline like the ones that I was showing you a couple of slides ago. You know, it results in these incredibly thorough directions, which I'm happy to share with you, and which actually are on a website that Pam Lack and I created together. But that step-by-step process that's going to build the whole. And at the lower division, so at the upper division, I'm more overt about the higher level thinking, and less so at the lower level class. But that's flipped when I'm talking about the scaffolding, because at the upper division class, I don't have to scaffold as much. Lower division, I do a lot of scaffolding of how students are building the skills of visualization. And this is a series of assignments to help students build the kind of content that they will add to the visualization. On the bottom left here, I start with something simple. You know, here's an image from a sort of visual narrative from the past, and I help students learn how to annotate that image and annotate it with a terminology that's specific to evaluating comics. Then the next little assignment the students do is they annotate and they make an assertion based on that annotation. Then the next thing they do is they annotate, they make an assertion, but then they support that assertion with a full paragraph. And then we push a little further, and I ask the students to take a page, annotate it, and we're moving from left to right across these examples, but then write a letter to the editor about why that visualization mattered to them. And so encouraging students to own their feelings, their ideas about the visualization that they're looking at, that they're trying to explain. Now, so I've talked about the need for explaining the big picture, have learning outcome driven material to scaffold the work along the way, whether it's upper division or lower division. But also key to these kinds of projects is close collaboration, because we're building something digital together when I'm working with my students, but sometimes I want that digital to be background. I don't necessarily want them to be involved in the nitty gritty of producing the digital, but I want them to benefit from that visualization. And so I've worked very closely with Pam Lack, taking my class. She talked about coming into the classroom, but I think it's really important to get my students into the center, the Digital Humanities Center, so that they realize that space matters. The space where they're learning matters. I work closely with Pam Lack to develop a workflow for capturing any kind of student contribution to the digital artifact, and reflect with Pam or any collaborator on what's working and what isn't. So that iterative process of design. Now, because I'm trying to help students produce content to go on a timeline that's going to tell a story over time of continuity and change, the students need to research as well. So I have to work closely, not just with a digital humanist, but also with librarians who will help my students do the research that needs to happen to go into this visualization. I wrote here on this slide, bells and whistles, which is how students interpret the digital. If it doesn't do something, it's just going to be noise unless the grounding is there, the research, the content is there. Now, another aspect of the collaboration I have done with Pam Lack is coming up with workflows to capture student contribution to something like a digital timeline. One of mine and Pam's light bulb moments was when we realized that creating timelines, and we use Timeline.js, creating timelines is essentially done in a Google spreadsheet. That's what sits behind one of these timelines. And then we started realizing, wait a second, we could use a Google form to produce the content for the Google spreadsheet. And then Pam, because she's fancy and she knows how to do digital things way better than I, taught me the word concatenation, where we can take some Google spreadsheet that's been created by a Google form and mush that together with what the timeline requires, so that all the digital is done on the back end, but the students get the benefit of the artifact that's created by this visualization, in some ways luring them into the value of doing these kinds of visualizations without forcing them to do the dirty work that's in the back end until they're ready, until they're sold on this as an approach. And Pam Lack does a great job of also creating help sheets, tutorials for the students to go step by step through how to create timelines, or how to fill in the answers needed on something like this Google form. So a lot of collaboration there to make these things happen. Another aspect, if I'm going to be student learning outcome driven, students care about how what they're doing digital relates to how they're going to be graded. So I always take care to have these clear rubrics that recognize both, will recognize the integration of the digital as well as the visual, as well as the historical. And I spend a lot of time thinking about the balance of those components. So if their contribution to the timeline is going to be 10 points, I need to think, okay, how does that balance? How do these different aspects of learning, of thinking that I'm trying to teach in my course, how do they balance against the rubric on which they're going to be graded? So another element there. Another aspect I think that's really important when I do this sort of collaborative work of creating timelines like this is to then make sure the students have to use this collaborative artifact for something. So in both the upper division class and the lower division class I teach, where students are doing this kind of timeline visualization, the final project in the class is to use the timeline to generate research questions that they will then explore on their own in a final paper about visualizing comics over time or visualizing Roman history. So to have the data viz not be the end result, but to be the generative output. Now, the last thing I wanted to say, speaking of generative output, is that as I started to do that with my students and ask them to do something with what we were creating in class together, I realized, wait a second, I can do something with what we're creating in the class together, and begin to ask my own research questions that I push forward with my own visualizations, not using the students' work, but just saying, oh, wow, these are really interesting research questions. I'm going to go and explore these on my own in other sorts of ways. So in this particular instance, the idea of how visualizations of witches change over time. So a lot that I've done there in a couple of minutes, but if you want to learn more about some of this, feel free to check out some of these articles, and I'll share this timeline or this Google slide deck with you. So thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, Elizabeth. That was great. And thank you, Chelsea, too. We have a good 10 minutes here for questions, so I hope we can get a good discussion going. Does anyone have a question right away? If no one is jumping up, I'll repeat the question that's in the chat for Elizabeth and maybe expand it to both of you. How difficult is it for students to learn the tech that you ask them to learn in the classroom?
Yeah, so I'll jump right in there. I think I may have answered that question in some ways already, but it depends on the course. In the lower division course, I in some ways hide the tech from them, so they don't fully understand. I mean, they can learn it if they want to, but they don't fully understand what's happening on the back end to create their contribution and to create the timeline out of their contributions. With the upper division students, sometimes I've had them, their second project be to create their own visualization in a course where we do story mapping, timelining, and then they choose, I want to dive into something. I want to do either a timeline or a story map, and then they have to learn the tech. And for that, I'm very fortunate in the collaboration with Pam Lack, who creates these amazing tutorials. It comes into my class. I scaffold it into the lessons across the full semester. And so it's not too difficult. I think the hardest thing for students to learn is the little bits of HTML that they want to learn because they want to make what they're doing cooler, more interactive, as Chelsea was describing, less linear and more nodal in some ways. So yeah, thank you. Chelsea, I think you were going to expand on this too.
Yeah, I mean, and you ending on HTML is perfect, because that's one of the courses I'm teaching right now is a web development course, and it's it's backed behind 3 other requirements. So I think for me, a big part of this, like you said, goes to like, which course is it? Lower division? Is it upper division? Where are they landing in their arc within the major? That has a lot to do with like how they engage with the tools. But we do a similar thing, really, which is to say that the early classes, it's really about getting them to the exciting, kind of engaging part of using the tech, and kind of using the more streamlined platform. So like when we're teaching JavaScript, for example, there is a library called P5JS from processing, and it's really focused on artists and designers and making it easy for people to make visuals very quickly while also writing code. And so students start with that in the lower and mid division courses. And now in my web development course, which is the last course, they're actually going backwards and learning the kind of more abstract basics of JavaScript, which are like way harder to convince someone who's in art to really engage with until they've got some buy-in. So we actually think that there's some really similar, some overlap there, in that we're really looking at like the balance between getting people excited, with also getting them to figure out how to become a lifelong learner for tech, because the one thing about all of these digital platforms, right, is that they change so fast. And they change with a rapidity that is like not the same for archival research, which is like, well, you're going to go to an archive, you're going to do a thing, and that might change, rules might change, some things might change over time, but the process of how to actually engage in the thing is going to be relatively static. Whereas with digital tools, one of the key things that we try to reinforce over and over again is really also for them to become self-motivated learners, and also a peer-to-peer learning model of like how can they support one another is another big piece of how we get students to engage with the difficulty of the tech. So.
Yeah, absolutely. And I just to pile on to what Chelsea was saying, some of the early portions of the Roman history work I do with my students, they are working in small groups to produce the contribution to the timeline, because that peer-to-peer instruction is so important. And we go into the Digital Humanities Center at San Diego State, and we have these wonderful tables that you can write on. And it's funny to see the students say, well, how did you do that on your slide? And they'll start doing HTML on the table and say, oh, well, I figured this out. And then someone else realizes, wait a second, there's HTML creators. And then the students start to just get excited about what each other is doing and learning more about what's possible. And I think you're right, exactly, Chelsea. Lifelong learners is what we want to create around these tools.
Are there any more questions from the group? If you don't feel like talking to, you can please feel free to put questions in the chat and I will read them out. All right, well, I will ask another question then. So one of the things I found inspiring about this combination of talks is that you both combine or draw connections between like the physical world and the digital world, or like traditional art forms and contemporary art forms. And I think one of our goals here is to help people who haven't gotten into the digital humanities side yet start to take those steps if they're interested. So how do you, maybe sort of a theoretical or intellectual questions, how do you make those connections between the digital and the physical world? How do you decide which digital things and which physical things you think might go together fruitfully or produce something interesting?
Yeah, that's a good question. So, I mean, I like to start this by also saying that like my degrees are in like sculpture and and 4D art. It sounds weird, but it really didn't have much to do with technology. I never actually took a formal like coding class ever. So like for me, I actually have a more traditional background, and I was interested in technology, but I always thought it honestly is like separate from art until I got to grad school. And I started to be able to think about them as intertwined. And for me, the thing that started to tip me off for like, oh, how could the technological help me in what I'm doing, was really to say like, where are the edges of what I'm able to do with the mediums that I'm engaging with. There are things that sculpture can do that code will never be able to do. There's like an affective, there's an experience, right, that is wholly its own. But then there are ways that digitally afflicted things allow me to work with like larger amounts of data and bring that to people in like a much more practical sense. Or when I'm thinking about like the visual cultural analysis, like if I'm wanting to hold up a visual reference and have that compared to another visual reference, sure, maybe I could use printmaking or painting and I could render that in all of these ways. But then it also becomes about painting. It becomes about all of those other material elements. Whereas switching over to the digital, especially when the archives themselves are digital scans and all of these things, it gets people, I think, closer to the object of the thing that I'm wanting them to look at. And so that's really where it started to come in, was like, how can the digital allow me to, activate these ideas, maybe along a different axis, and also maybe allow the viewer to get a little bit closer to the source material that is kind of driving me in the practice to begin with. I don't know if that totally answers the question, but that's kind of how I think about it.
Yeah, and I'll echo exactly what you were saying, Chelsea. We agree on a lot. For me, I similarly was not trained in computer language, but I was trained in foreign language. I was trained as a classicist, a so-called classicist, someone who does Greek and Latin in order to understand the distant past. But when I started doing my research on witchcraft in antiquity, I realized that the evidence was incredibly multimodal. I was looking at the representations between realities of women's practice of witchcraft and representations in text. And I wanted to put those two together. I wanted to see the dissonance. I wanted to see where they agreed, where they disagreed, and where that juxtaposition was going to tell me something. And when you're typing that on a page, it doesn't happen. But when you can use the digital to put, I just use this word multimodal evidence, to put it in conversation with one another at the click of a button, then or even simultaneously, that makes the arguments more clear, more exciting. And so that, I think that's one of the things that I like most about the digital and anchoring what I'm doing with visualization in this kind of process.
Yeah, I would say for me, it's like, it's as much a thinking tool as it is a production tool. So
absolutely.
Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you both. Rhonda, you have a question.
Yeah, I'm sorry to do this like right as we're ending, but that's how it goes, right? To kind of to dovetail on that, one of the things that I think in the presentations, both this one and the previous iteration, that started coming to the fore was the ways that the digital humanities tools are not just efficiency makers, they're not just kind of distribution tools, but they actually change the way that we think and the way that students think. And so you both outlined the ways that digital technologies have shaped your own practices. Have you noticed the ways that students respond and change their kind of thought process and assimilation? Yeah. And maybe, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, Ron and I teach in the same program. So I think we depends on the course that we're teaching, right? But I think that that's actually one of the key things to get folks invested in it, is if you can get students to realize that it's not like, oh my God, why do I have to learn HTML? But rather, oh my gosh, look at this thing that I can do with this, that's really the trick, along with that kind of lifelong learner thing, is to get them to see how they can activate their thinking. And I think that for me, I see it more in the upper division courses when they've had a lot more of that scaffolding than I see it in the lower division. But I do think that, it is possible, and that students, I think that it really activates them in our program around collaboration, a lot more than collaboration in some of the more traditional art programs that are both here on our campus and other places I've been. The digital really helps them band together in creating projects and learning together in a way that I think art can feel a little bit more of a siloed solo endeavor without the digital as a tool for that. So.
And one of the things I do to try to make sure I capture that, because we've talked about the professional element of this, we need to capture what it is we're doing with our students, is I encourage them to blog about their experience of how what they're seeing is changing over time. And then I'll push out some of their more profound blogs to a wider public. So yes.